Welcome back to the Hardware Unboxed podcast. I believe we're up to episode 41 now, and this one, again, all about Zen 5. We've obviously had the releases of the 9950X and 9900X that we talk about, a few more angles that have come out from those releases, the revelation of this sort of interesting Windows performance thing that's going on with Ryzen that we covered on the channel lately, and also how AMD has handled the Zen 5 release and a bit of Steve's frustration at the communication from AMD over Zen 5 performance. So yeah, big episode, lots of interesting Zen 5 content. If that's what you want, this is a great podcast for you. So let's get straight into it. More Zen 5 CPUs, Steve. I think they pretty much went as expected. So we'll be talking about them in this week's podcast, surely.
Yeah, I don't know how much time and energy we'll put into the 12 and 16 core parts specifically. There's not too much to talk about and say there. Based on what we saw from the 6 and 8 core parts, stuff like gaming performance was pretty well expected. Again, some small variation across reviews, but I don't think anything too crazy like some people might be claiming. Even the Windows versus Linux-based gaming stuff, which I'm sure we can talk about later on, the discrepancies there haven't been huge. And I haven't really seen any compelling data yet to suggest that this is a Windows / Linux, a problem on Windows that is solved via Linux. Any workloads that you can compare across reviews like 7-zip and stuff like that, it seems pretty similar, really. I think the main point of difference here is the actual applications that are used for benchmarking. AMD themselves have come out and said that Zen 5, the architecture there, was targeting server workloads, development software, AI, that sort of stuff. And that's where it appears to shine based on the limited selection of review data that we have to pull from. But yeah, stuff like gaming, pretty universally disappointing, I think. I don't really think there's certainly the reviews that have shown impressive gaming gains as a whole have been outliers, right?
Yeah.
And AMD's own review guide has said that you're looking at about a 5% uplift to comparable Zen 4 parts. AMD has now finally released that data. They did so in time for the 12 and 16 core parts. So if AMD is saying that it's about a 5% performance uplift on average, I mean, that's got to be the best case, right? Because even I think you'll agree their review data, some of it is very odd. A lot of it seems to be cherry-picked based on really old games using canned benchmarks. We're talking about games like maybe Total War. There's some other League of Legends, for example. We're talking about 900 frames per second, and there may be a 50 frame discrepancy there between the two parts, but you're talking about a few percent difference because the frame rates are so absurdly high. And while I'm not a League of Legends player, I don't really play Dota or League or anything like that. Those games absolutely do not require hundreds of frames per second to play competitively. Certainly not like a game like Counter-Strike, for example. So anyway, weird selection of games, weird results, but even so, they only found a 5% uplift on average.
It pretty much just shows that the presentation data at launch wasn't really as accurate as it could have been. I mean, to be fair, they didn't compare the 9700X to the 7700X or the 9950X to the 7950X to show those 5% differences. And
sorry, I'm just laughing at you because I'm like, yeah, no kidding. That's
there's a reason why they didn't. But I mean, a lot of what was inferred from the release information was how it compares to the Intel parts. And I think their data, as seen in the review guide, is probably optimistic for how it compares to the Intel parts. And yeah, a lot of older benchmarks, those sorts of things. And then obviously, one of their executives coming up on stage and saying that it would be faster than a 7800 X3D probably was a bit of a blunder, probably not accurate, and probably shouldn't have been said. So
yeah, a lot of people picked you up on that and said you're, I guess, being disingenuous. That was an obvious mistake on their behalf. But it actually, it was an obvious mistake. Yes, you're pointing that out, but they were claiming it was a slip of words, a slip of the tongue, which it absolutely wasn't. They went on talking about the gains over the 5800X3D And then they went to say, when compared to the Zen 4 version, the 7800X3D, it'll be a couple of percent faster. That was very deliberate, very direct. It was...
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to put into that video like a 5-minute long clip where they're talking about how it compares to the 5800 X3D, and then like I was like, oh, this is pretty clear cut. Like he clearly says that it's faster than a 7800 X3D. Like he names the part, and Zen 4 versus Zen 5. He talked about that, said it was a couple of percent faster. And yeah, some people thought that it was just a simple slip of the tongue or whatever. He meant to say 5800 X3D. Not the case. The full data, well, not the full data, the full presentation, it was basically that slide was talked about in two parts, 5800 XGD first, and then they went on to say what was probably not true about the 7800 XGD. Again, we haven't even seen AMD's internal data about how it compares to the 7800 XGD to know how wrong that was. And they're probably never going to reveal that, but
they were clearly talking about
accurate.
They were clearly talking about two different things, right? Because they were saying it's 12% faster on average than the 5800 X3D. And then they were saying that means it's a couple of percent faster than the Zen 4 7800 X3D. That's a very deliberate sentence.
Yeah.
So there's no mincing of words there. It's very easy to say 7800 X3D when you mean 5800 X3D. So if you had said it's going to be 12% faster than the 7800 X3D, and the slide showed 12% faster than the 5800 X3D, then sure, it's like, oh, okay, you said the wrong thing. That's a bit embarrassing, but probably shouldn't do that in official presentations to the media. And if you do, correct it. Like the audio recording is still there to this date with them claiming that. And media such as yourself and others reported on it at the time, and AMD didn't correct anyone. They were just like, yep.
Yeah, and I'm not going to email them being like, is this correct? Is this correct for things that they've said in their information that they're providing? It's like I'm assuming that if you're giving me information in a recording or on a slide or something that it's correct. Like it doesn't need fact checking in that way. So yeah, I mean, it was a recorded presentation. If it wasn't true, it could have been edited out easily. Like I didn't see it live or anything. I took the video file that they provided me and put it into that video. So, but yeah, I mean, that's just going back to their presentation sort of issues that they had with this launch. It's pretty clear that these parts, and I think the reviews of, at least what I've seen from the 9950X reviews, is sort of more reflective of, there's fewer, I don't know, excuses for how the Zen 5 CPUs performed. It was more, we're comparing this part to the older part at the same power, so that we can't really show the efficiency angle this time around, which I think is what you had alluded to previously when you said that these comparisons will not be able to use that as sort of a reason to excuse away, the Ryzen performance.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, there's definitely a number of factors at play here, and I'm not pointing the finger at anyone. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. As I said in, I think it was, I don't even know, a video recently, basically, I, of all people, understand how difficult the day one reviews are, right? You're kind of in the dark, especially with this one. AMD did not do us any favors. You're trying to work out, because it's a big part of your credibility, right? You can't put out a review that goes against the grain and is actually wrong. It's one thing to go against the grain, but you don't want to be wrong. Like if you've put out a review on day one saying the 9700X is on average 10% or 15% faster than the 7700X for gaming, that's wrong, and that's bad for your credibility. So you don't want to do that. So I get why for the first round of reviews, reviewers were hesitant to just come out and be like, this thing sucks. It's a flop. It's a disaster. There's no performance. And my initial reaction was I was confused. As I admitted on the last podcast, I spent half of a week coping. I'm like, this can't be right. This isn't right. Like they said a 16% IPC uplift. They showed 10% in the one game that they did show at Computex. They've since said that it offers gaming leadership over, Core i7 14700Ks and Core i9 14900Ks. So we can't be seeing a performance regression in some games and a couple of percent improvement overall. And that was a big part of my frustrations with the whole review process, because we just didn't know. And I don't want to release a review saying, guys, this thing sucks. It's 2% faster on average, or 3% in our case. That is a joke. And then every other review is like, it's 15% faster on average. It's amazing. So yeah, obviously you can reach out to other reviewers and stuff, but I guess what I'm getting at is you look at maybe some smaller media outlets or just other reviewers in general, they're worried about their reputation, the backlash, because I mean, there's a lot of backlash that comes with either getting it wrong or, just being negative. And, I mean, I don't think we saw too many death threats this time or any, which was good because
wow, setting a high bar there, Steve. No death threats. Great.
Well, you say that. I'm not sure if you remember or are aware. You weren't working for Hardware Unboxed at the time, but we went to bat for Gamers Nexus back in 2017 when the Ryzen CPUs first burst onto the scene.
Yeah.
And
yep.
Gamers Nexus probably had one of the more negative reviews of Ryzen. And yeah, Steve was getting death threats. Like they were going after him hard. And then we made a dedicated video and we talked about the Gamers Nexus results and the backlash and being like, they're not wrong. Like the gaming performance of these CPUs isn't amazing. They look like they're heading in the right direction. We think Ryzen can go somewhere. But at the moment, it's not killing Intel. Like it's kind of embarrassing compared to Intel, but it has other attributes that sort of help save face a bit. Anyway, so knowing how loony the internet is and how companies like AMD might react to negative content, they do allocate the samples and whatnot. If you're a smaller channel, that does play a role. I'm not saying people necessarily take that into account, but it is a factor. So I can see why the initial reviews would have been a bit softer. And there was, as you said, the whole confusion, which we talked about last time, and you said I pointed out, was the power thing. And Gamers Nexus has since, I think the words they used was harden. Did I say since? I meant to say since. Hardened their stance on the Zen 5 architecture in general and parts like the 9600X and 9700X they make. It's basically like the thing we said that was good about them was that they're more power efficient. And it turns out not necessarily true for all workloads. In fact, for most workloads, probably not true. They dedicated, I think, a 30-minute or almost 40-minute content piece to that. So,
and I think PC, was it PC World or one of those outlets that didn't even publish their 9700X review
World.
because
they
were like, hey, these results are seeming to be very low and not where we expected them to be, so we're going to hold off and see if it's a bug or something. And
which again is fair enough. Like their reputation's on the line. If PC World comes out and says these things stink, or they don't even have to say that, they just have to show underwhelming game performance. And if that's out of line with what others are showing, then that's not good for them. So smart of them to do that. The alternative is to do what we did, reach out to guys like Gamers Nexus. I spoke with Nick at Gear Seekers at length, Andy from eTechnics, Michael at Tech Power Up, and I spoke to lots of different guys. Even more recently, we were in contact with Igor's lab, and so a lot of different guys reached out. It was actually pretty crazy for the second wave how many reviewers reached out to us with their data and said, like, what the hell is this? Is this what the 9950X does? What are you seeing? And I guess they reached out to me because I talked about reaching out to other reviewers in my original Zen 5 content. Anyway, everyone, as far as I could tell, was getting pretty similar numbers. And that it's always funny when the reviews go live and you get that small vocal minority in the comment section going, Hardware Unboxed, that you don't know what you're doing, or there's definitely something wrong with your setup. Like every other review is getting way different results. And then they'll point to the one review that's actually the outlier that supports whatever argument they want to make. It's like, hang on a minute. I was in contact with like a dozen key reviewers before these things went live, and I saw their data before you got to see it. I know what you're saying isn't true. So it's that whole, what we spoke about last week, the whole, for lack of a better term, the whole coping process, which, that's right. I have some sympathy for it. Like I get excited about this tech. I don't really care who's winning. All I want is to ensure competition, because that leads to better products in the future, better prices right now, and just a better industry ecosystem environment for consumers to enjoy these products. So we just want competition, and Zen 5 has sort of in a lot of ways, especially for us and our interests, failed in that pursuit of making it more interesting and pushing things forward. And there's other knock-on effects to that as well. Like, what does it mean for the AM5 platform now? Because the AM5 platform's effectively gone 2 years into its life, and we've gone nowhere with it. So how many more years is
Yeah.
it till we see a step forward? And I think there's going to be massive ramifications here for AMD. I think this is really going to blow up in their face. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you're wrong. We discussed Zen 6 and whether that's even on AM5. My coping mechanism is like, you're definitely wrong, Tim, despite the fact that all your arguments are logical and sound, which is normally the way I used to guide myself forward. I'm going to cope on this one. So yeah, I mean, if AM5 ends up bombing, so that is to say that Zen 6 isn't on it, or Zen 6 is on it and doesn't offer a noticeable performance improvement, which I find hard to believe, it's like AMD has promised that the advantage of AM5 is the broad platform compatibility, the longevity of the platform. And they just came out and said they're supporting it to 2027 plus. And, we know what that can mean, because it can just mean that they're going to rehash CPUs till the end of time like they've done with AM4. Doesn't necessarily mean anything. But at the same time, they've come out and stated that they've stated it as, guys, consumers, people out there, this is the reason to buy AM5. We are supporting this platform long-term, much more long-term than our competitor does. So buy into AM5 because you're going to see a similar thing to what we produced with AM4 is essentially what they're saying there, right? I mean, you don't have to read into it. You don't have to make too many wild assumptions to come to that conclusion.
No, that's definitely what they're claiming. And I think the issue with, even if Zen 6 is on the platform, it's kind of, if you have one standstill generation, then Zen 6 versus Zen 4 may not be as large as what you were expecting, and may not justify an upgrade, which is very different to what we saw in AM4. The differences between the early Ryzen processors and Zen 3, especially with the extra E parts, was pretty significant, which
Massive.
is why
Insane.
AM4 was as successful as it was. You got these parts that were so much better at the end of the lifespan. And I guess maybe part of that was AMD had to do a lot of catching up. So there was a lot of room for improvement. They added more cores. They doubled the core count on that platform, and all those sorts of factors probably weren't going to play out a second time on AM5. But I think the expectation is still there that AM5 was going to provide some sort of significant performance improvement from the first generation to the last generation on that platform.
Even if it's to half the degree, that's still a success.
Yeah, exactly. Like half the degree would be 40, 50% more performance. So, I mean, that's pretty good. But yeah, when you have a standstill generation, it sort of adjusts all expectations. It also means that when Intel comes out with their processors, they're starting from a different position instead of being potentially, behind one generation in performance, or they don't have any sort of upgradability on that platform at the time. They're now at a similar position potentially. If they support one more generation, it's probably not going to be that different from what AM5 is providing. So yeah, it has significant ramifications for people investing in AM5 and wanting to buy good motherboards, wanting to jump on that platform. But I think on top of that, it affects AMD's reputation as a company. And, we're already sort of seeing the cope, I guess, turned into more criticism of AMD. So in the beginning with these parts, it was very much, there's got to be something wrong, right? Like there's some issue, the TDP's wrong, or it's underperforming, or there's some sort of benchmark that's not working right, to now it just being, okay, these CPUs aren't that good. And that has effects. Like it affected Intel with 11th gen, 13th gen, 14th gen to a lesser degree. Obviously, the stability issues are having a huge role at the moment for Intel. So having a failed generation, it impacts what people expect from the next generation. People are going to be less excited about Zen 6, and they're certainly not going to be believing the marketing materials that are coming out for a next-gen CPU launch. Like there's just, you burn that bridge. Like I feel like a company like NVIDIA has burnt that bridge with marketing numbers. Like people look at DLSS on numbers for games and everyone's like, okay, whatever. Like I'm not really going to pay much attention to that. And I feel like AMD's heading towards that in terms of lack of trust in numbers and those sorts of things from launch presentations. And it takes a while to recover from that. I mean, you launch a good product, they could probably recover within one generation with how things are at the moment. But yeah, it's not good.
Well,
Like it's not like this is improving AMD's standing in the market. They've taken a hit with Zen 5 for
sure.
consumers, to be clear.
Yeah, absolutely. The only sort of caveat, disclaimer I'll give to this is that we haven't seen the X3D chips yet.
That's true. Yep.
Now, I am making no assumptions as to how good or bad they will be. I am expecting similar scaling to what we've already seen, but that's not set in concrete for me. There are a few variables at play that could mean that the X3D chips are going to be better than expected.
Yep.
But that is not my expectation. Essentially, I'm going to wait and see before I call that one. But let's just say that the X3D chips somehow unlock that extra game performance and are really great value or whatever. They become great products. Then that does save AM5 and this generation.
Yeah,
I think
pricing can be adjusted and stuff as well.
Yeah,
so that's all
that's
part
right.
of it.
So I think that's fair to say. So there is still hope. I guess we'll go with. We'll see what happens there. But basically, I don't want to say that it's all done and dusted and Zen 5 as a whole has completely failed. The Zen 5 CPUs that we've seen so far at their current pricing are definitely a fail. If they filter down to the same prices as the current Zen 4 CPUs, then I don't think it's a great success. I just think it's like, yeah, okay, fine. Let's move forward with that. But yeah, if essentially it is all riding on X3D, right? Because if X3D doesn't hit it out of the park or at least justify its existence more so than the Zen 5 parts we've seen so far have, then the advantage of the platform longevity, the whole reason to go, well, one of the big selling points of AM5, let's say, is no longer a factor. It's actually dead in the water there. It's done and dusted. Because we think maybe we're getting one more generation. I seriously doubt we're getting 2 more generations on this socket. So the advantage over Intel's gone there. If Arrow Lake turns out to be good, then the platform thing's just the same for both, right? They have one more generation to come, and we're hoping that those generations are good.
Yeah, that's right. Because people would be upgrading from AM4 and then making the call, do I go AM5 or do I go the Arrow Lake platform, whatever it turns out to be? And there's always that option of, oh yeah, you could jump on Zen 4 at a sort of a cheaper processor and then, I don't know, think about upgrading to X3D or a Zen 6 part down the line somewhere. But if the gains are not there, so
it completely nullifies that argument.
Yeah, I mean, if Zen 4 to Zen 5 was a 20% gain and then you got 20% again from Zen to Zen 6, then yeah, you could jump on with a 7600 and get a substantial performance gain to a Zen 6 processor. But when Zen 5 isn't giving you that first 20% bump, the difference from Zen 4 to Zen 6 becomes a lot lower, and it really negates the whole selling point. As you said, like you could just go to Arrow Lake, the Arrow Lake platform, potentially get a similar performance uplift from the cheapest Arrow Lake part to the future, whatever's after Arrow Lake. I'm sure they've announced it, but I can't remember off the top of my head, to that part, the best part on that platform. You'd probably see a similar performance gain. So yeah, that has a big impact. And I think as well that AMD's internally, it seems like they were expecting a lot more from this generation, which is probably why they released AM5, Zen 4, there's a lot of excitement. And internally, there would have been discussion about, well, Zen 5 is this huge architecture overhaul on the cores. So there's no way that's going to be bad, right? Like we know what we've designed there and we know there's significant changes. So, let's go all out on this AM5 thing, right? Like it's got to be good, surely. And then the parts come out and it turns out that it's not quite there. And I do have some sympathy for leakers as well in this. Like I know some people have been dunking on people who've leaked Zen 5 information over the years. But if AMD internally is thinking that these parts are really good, and even if they launched, like, let's say, for example, that the launch presentation that we saw for Zen 5 was leaked months ahead of time. Like we saw the the performance data compared to the 14900K. We'd seen the claims of it beating the 7800X3D. If those are the internal expectations, those leaks could have been true, just an exaggeration because they didn't quite know exactly how the CPUs would perform in the end. So it's kind of like if the internal expectations are wrong, it just changes all of the marketing things that are going on, how you present AM5 as a platform. Leakers get screwed over. Not that I care too much about leakers getting things wrong, but
can I jump in?
yeah,
I agree with what you're saying. That's just par for the course, right? You can get burnt at the final hour because they
yeah,
completely change pricing. The mistake I've seen with leakers, and I'm not pointing at anyone in particular, I'm talking about leakers who have come and gone, just the leaking scene in general, let's say,
yeah,
is sort of this desire or need to be right, to be like, I leaked that.
yeah, absolutely.
That information's accurate. I'm going to die by that information, or change it last second and pretend I never said it. But just, I haven't really seen a leaker who says, this is what I'm hearing. Like almost like impartial to the information. This is the information I've been leaked. Is it accurate? I don't know. Am I a leaking genius? Am I the world's best analyst? No. This is the information I've presented. It sort of makes sense, but we'll have to wait and see how this pans out as we get closer to the release date and we get more information. I haven't seen anyone sort of, and to be fair, I don't watch a lot of the leaking stuff, but I haven't seen someone tackle it that way, where they're sort of just, this is the information I've got. I didn't do anything amazing to get this information. I just spoke with someone. I mean, you and I could be leakers, right? We go to Computex, we talk with the engineers. They tell us all manner of things. And often we do get accurate information that's more accurate than the actual official leaks. But we don't leak that because we're like, well, I don't really want to stake my reputation on that information that I learned over a beer. Maybe it's right. But I guess what I'm getting at is the problem I see with all the leaks or the majority of the leaks that I watch is that it's kind of like a personal thing. I have to be right about this, or I don't know. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, do you agree with this? Is this something you agree with? I don't know. Like, that's the vibe I get from the whole thing.
I think with all content, it's like it's okay to be wrong. Like, there's so long as you don't try and claim that you're right when you're wrong. It's it's a learning experience, and that comes with reviewing products, right? We've seen some of the reviews for these parts have some things in them that weren't correct, and then people, Gamers Nexus is a great example, produces a review talking about the efficiency of the parts, and then it turns out with more information, you learn that what you said originally was not correct. So then you correct it. There's no, I'm not going to double down on this. It's like, yeah, you take the L on that one and you improve and you correct the information, and that just strengthens the reviews and everything. I think the same thing could apply to leaks as well, but we don't see as much of it, which I think is what you were sort of saying as well. Like, if you're getting information 6 months ahead of time and it's all, we're expecting this new thing in the future to be really good. Here's what we're expecting from it. And then as you get to closer to launch or even after launch, it turns out that that information 6 months ago wasn't accurate or was wrong or potentially had oversold what the parts do. And let's be honest, most leaks oversell the capabilities of the parts. I think across GPUs and CPUs, the majority of the time they are overestimating what those parts can do. You can own it when it, like, there's nothing wrong with sort of saying, yeah, okay, I got that information 6 months ago. The internal expectations were that the parts are going to be really good, and it turns out, as we've seen from the launch, that they were underwhelming. Like, they didn't meet their internal expectations, and it doesn't mean the leak is wrong. It just means that the information at the time didn't have the full information. Like, potentially they hadn't benchmarked. It wasn't the final silicon. They hadn't benchmarked everything yet. Or in the case of some things, it could be, hey, we think these parts are going to be really fast because we added AVX 512 to them, and that gives a huge performance improvement. So maybe across the board, you'll see a 20% gain, and it could be as much as double the performance. And then you look across a wide variety of tests at launch, and it turns out that's a very niche application of that task. So there's a lot of different ways that you could sort of approach getting that information and it not being accurate by the time that it's out. But yeah, there has been issues with the sort of, I've got to be right. Like, there's a double down on this. That information was always correct and something's wrong now. It's like, yeah, if you get information 6 months ahead of time, there's probably going to be some issues with it. It's probably not going to tell the full story.
I mean, we have official information change 2 weeks out from launch on multiple occasions. I think it's just about being, a bit, I don't know if humble's the right word to use, but just, present the information. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Just put it out there as you've heard this. Let's see how it plays out. And I think most people will accept that as, okay, well, this is exciting. We've heard this, but they've said, they can't guarantee that's what's going to happen. We'll just have to wait and see. And you're always going to get people who attack you and go, you're an idiot. You said this. But I think the vast majority of people would appreciate that more honest stance of, I've heard this, seems to make sense, but of course, things can change. And then if you get it right, be like, okay, well, the information I was given there turned out to be true and nothing changed last minute to make it not true. So that's great. And that's sort of the end of the story, but I feel like it has to be rubbed in your face that, I got that one right though. So all of these ones that were wrong. So I see a bit of that on the leaking scene, and we've even been involved in that, right? Was it Zen 3 where you analyzed a few leaks in your Friday news segment?
It could have been Zen 2, but yeah, one of those.
I think, actually it might have even been Zen 2. Yeah, I'm pretty certain it was Zen 2 now that you mention it. Doesn't matter. And you just said, like, these leaks to me don't pass my common sense test. Am I right? Don't know yet, but I don't think that these leaks are going to turn out to be accurate. And you copped a heap of backlash from people who wanted to believe in the leaks, and even the leaker themselves were unhappy with you not agreeing with them. Whereas the way that should have been handled was, okay, Tim has an opinion on the leaks.
Yeah.
You don't need to dig the hole bigger. Just be like, okay, Tim has a difference of opinion. He doesn't think they make sense. I disagree with him. Tim said his piece. I've said my piece. No further intervention required, right? Let them roll out and see who's right. Anyway,
I think if you position yourself as needing to have everything right and not being able to sort of, I don't know, say at the end of the day that things are wrong that you heard previously, it makes this sort of weird situation where people are probably more likely to call you out for those things as well. Mm-hmm. Like if you're presenting yourself as, I get everything right, and then you're hearing information which, again, could have been 100% accurate at the time, things change last minute, things move around, you hear more things, right? Mm-hmm. You're gonna cop more backlash for that sort of position. Whereas, as you say, like, things change, you hear things, they could be right, could be wrong. And if you just present it more as how, hey, this is the internal expectations for these parts from this company at this time, which is probably accurate for the Zen 5 leaks that we're seeing, then yeah, you just present it that way, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I'm not a leaker, so I'm not going to sit here and say like, well, this is how I do it because I want to be a leaker, so I do it this way. Ultimately, I don't really care that much, but
No, same here. But at the end of the day, why are people watching? And a lot of people do watch the leaked content or the leakers' content. Why are they watching that? They're not watching it because they think every single last thing is going to be accurate. And they're not watching it to get accurate information that's completely or near enough useless to them 6 months out. They're doing it because they're passionate about PC hardware. They're excited about it. They're excited to hear what's coming up. And and I guess that's why stuff like Zen 5 hits so hard, because they've been excited about it for so long. They can't wait to see what Zen 5 has to offer. And then when it's a stinker, it hits differently like that. But people are watching these things, as I said, to get excited about it. So as long as the information you're giving is honest from the companies really have told you, the leaked information really is that, then I think you just present that. People take it for what it is. They get excited by it, and then we see how it plays out. But you don't need to aggressively defend that information and sort of attack anyone who disagrees. But anyway, it's probably enough about the leak stuff because, you and I really don't care about it one way or the other.
And to be fair, like if you're producing a ton of videos on leaks, there's plenty of opportunities over the time to sort of, change the story. And I hope that if we saw a leaker that did the sort of more what we've been saying in this video, that people wouldn't go and be like, oh, you're changing your story from one piece of content to the next piece of content. It's like, yeah, we've heard things well before launch that have turned out not to be true, but were probably true at the time. And we've seen products where companies will change the spec like days before the product launch.
Yeah, well,
So,
some dopes are going to do that. It's the internet.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to get some dummies that do that. You just ignore them. The point is, I think the vast majority of level-headed, intelligent people will go, okay, got that wrong, but did give the disclaimer that, it was early leaked information. They weren't 100% sure on it, and they gave various reasons for why the information could be wrong, what could change, blah, blah, blah. Usual disclaimer stuff. And again, I'm not watching it going, oh, I'm taking notes, I'm making financial investments based on this 6-month out leaked information. You're just watching going, that's really interesting. I hope that's true, because that would be very cool. That's something to be a bit excited about, but let's see how it plays out. I think that's how most people watch the leaks.
Yeah, I think with Zen 5, obviously these parts seem to be good at some things and not good at others. So if there is internal excitement around how it performs for server processors, which, let's be honest, AMD makes far more money from server parts than from consumer parts, and then you sort of apply what you're hearing from server parts to desktop parts when it maybe not the case, then there's many different ways, and this is what I was sort of talking about at the start of the leaking discussion. There's many different ways where information can be correct at the time or apply to certain things that down the line, Chinese whispers sort of thing, eventually it turns out to be taken to mean something else and not true at the end. But let's move on, because I want to talk about the Windows bug that you made a video about a couple of days ago. Actually, no, just be yesterday, because this podcast is going out today. Nice. All right, Windows bug.
We're in almost real time.
So AMD claimed that the discrepancy between their internal data and your review data was because they had tested in the Windows hidden administrator account that no one should be using.
Yep, sorry, go on, yep.
So they were saying, hey, our Zen 5 data, we're seeing a little bit of a performance gain by using this administrator account, and they'd presented that to you as a reason why maybe there was some differences in data between you and AMD. And you've tested it and found that it's kind of a nothing burger in the sense that it doesn't make Zen 5 appear any better, but it kind of also is a performance bug in Windows.
Well, okay, clarify a few things. I want to be careful. I don't want to claim that AMD said that this was the problem. Basically, AMD was searching for what could be the problem.
Yeah.
They found that there was a substantial performance uplift in the examples they were looking at by using the system administrator account, and thought, this was all happening in real time. I don't know how much additional testing they did. I don't exactly know what their thoughts were. Basically, they found this thing. It seemed like at the time they were just testing something like the 9700X. And they're like, oh, here, it's confusing, right? Because you would have to assume that they were seeing the performance I was seeing in the local administrator account, which is a bit weird, but then saw the performance bump in the system administrator account. And then how they attribute that to being the difference must have meant they were testing originally in the system administrator account, which is really a weird way of testing because no one uses their computer that way and probably shouldn't. So that aspect of it is all really confusing, right? And doesn't really make sense because it's a testing scenario you shouldn't be using. And unless it's a bug in the sense that sometimes you're seeing the system administrator performance in the local administrator account, because we don't even know A, if it's a bug, and B, what's causing it. So all I know for sure is AMD suggested that this could be responsible for the discrepancy in review data, and they believed it to be, based on the language they were using to me, to be something that would be addressed via a future Windows update. Now, we don't actually know that it's to do with the elevated privileges. Like, for example, they don't necessarily have to be a thing. It's just that they're solving the problem. Whether there's a workaround where you can achieve that performance uplift in bursty workloads without the elevated privileges is yet to be seen. But it sounds like AMD tested the 9700X, saw this performance uplift and thought, oh, maybe there's a Windows thing going on here because we're seeing the performance we should be in the system admin. They then contacted me and said, can you try this? If you are able to confirm this data, we will probably relay that to reviewers and give them the heads up. And I was like, whoa. Okay, let me test it first. And I really want to see what this does for Zen 4 because, I appreciate that this could be a Zen 5 bug, but I haven't heard information from AMD at this point that is the case. And I asked them about that and they didn't really confirm or deny. So anyway, I left it at that. That was the information they gave me. They weren't making any claims. They were just asking me to help verify what they were seeing as sort of step one. And they did sort of ask that I don't go public. I mean, they didn't specify that. They sort of said, can we just keep this between ourselves until we work out what's going on? Because they didn't obviously want false information leaking out yet to create a whole shitstorm, for a lack of a better term. So I sort of said, yeah, no worries, I'll test it and I'll get back to you tomorrow because, it takes quite a bit of time to do this testing. So on my end, right, this is from my perspective, I test the 9700X and I was like, because I was expecting nothing here. I'm like, okay, these things usually result in nothing. It's some sort of weird configuration issue or something like that. So they're adamant that it improves Cyberpunk performance. And they were really hung up on my Cyberpunk results. They wanted to solve that problem. So they said, can you please test Cyberpunk and get back to us? So I was like, all right. I do the thing. I reconfigure for the bloody 10th time, which I've got sick of doing, run the Cyberpunk test. And I'm like, what the hell? These frame rates are a lot. Like straight away, the second, you start your benchmark pass, and I know I've tested the 9700X that many times now. I know what frame rate it gives you at each point of the benchmark. And within the first 5 seconds, I was like, this is definitely faster. What the hell? I got to the end of the benchmark run plus 10 FPS, which is not an insignificant performance boost. So I'm sort of like, I wouldn't say I was panicking, but I'm like, holy crap. Maybe Zen 5 doesn't suck for gaming. I mean, look, it doesn't make it amazing, but if you go from 3% on average closer to 10%, again, not mind-blowing, but it is a substantial difference, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking to myself, okay, what other games sucked? The Last of Us Part 1, let's try that. Boom, straight away load up the test, and I'm seeing much better FPS instantly. Okay, start working through the games. Hogwarts Legacy, much better, much better. I think I got 10% or something more of a gain there. And then get to the end of the results, and I think I shared it with you at the time. And I said to you, I was like, dude, check this out. Like the 9700X is now quite a bit faster than the 7700X. I said, but I haven't tested the 7700X with these elevated privileges. I suspect maybe that'll get a performance uplift as well. And I'm not sure that AMD's had time to test that. So sure enough, I'm sitting here just thinking, all right, I don't know what to make of this yet. Just got to run all the tests before I jump to any conclusions. Ran Zen 4 through, and sure enough, it's like, oh, okay. So the administrator account is removing some sort of like security feature that isn't hurting performance, or less bloatware, spyware, whatever you want to blame for the difference. It seems to be fairly universal. AMD is suggesting that this is a bug that will be addressed with an update. I personally have no idea. I'm going off their information and input there. But I'm sitting here thinking, okay, they're talking to me about this issue. They're definitely communicating with other media around the world about this issue and asking them to test it and get back to them, because it wouldn't make sense that they just reach out to little old Hardware Unboxed, right? And I said to you, I reckon at some point someone is going to just test the 9700X, be a little bit mind blown like I was, and release that data. And everyone's going to jump to the conclusion, because everyone was already saying Windows is to blame here, right? That was the new narrative. someone should timeline this thing, but we went through TDPs, and then we went to PBO, and then we went to, there was like the Cope cycle of the next thing. And at the time, the hot topic was Windows versus Linux. Windows is to blame. So I thought someone for sure, like I could just foresee it now. And I'm not blaming anyone. I'm not calling anyone out. I'm not saying we're better than anyone. I'm just saying someone will have heard, because you've got AMD in your ear, right? AMD is saying, we suspect this is the problem. So a lot of people will have heard, oh, AMD's onto it. They've done their internal testing. They think it's Windows, and they've got some compelling evidence. And you test, and you're like, yeah, well, the 9700X is 10% faster. And then you just show that. You just test the 9700X, and you show it's like 10% faster than the 7700X, problem solved. So I was first and foremost concerned about that happening because, we had the SMT thing before that. I was onto Windows. So my priority wasn't so much exposing a Windows bug. It was, all right, guys, if you hear about this issue, which some reviewers in the 9950X reviews talked about this Windows administrator thing, so it was starting to get out into the wild. If you hear about this problem, it's not a Zen 5 thing, all right? We can confirm that Zen 4 sees the same performance uplift. Not exactly sure if it's a bug. Not sure if you should run the system administrator account for your gaming. I just want to make it absolutely clear that this is not a Zen 5 bug. And that was the whole purpose of the video, just to knock that one on its head straight away, so it's not a whole... Because could you just imagine if someone came out and just tested the 9700X and compared that to the review data? Like,
yeah, it'd be a whole thing.
It'd be a whole thing. Like, every review would be getting spammed. You've tested wrong. It's Windows that's to blame, or blah, blah. You've tested in the wrong configuration. You've got to use the system admin account. Oh God, it'd be a whole thing, and it would be so hard to correct the story on that one once that sort of leak had gotten out. So if I had my time again on that video, because I did rush it out after I heard people catching wind of this, which was, my fear that would happen, I would probably, if I had my time again, I'd probably say, look, we don't know if this is a Windows bug, right? It could just be that by running an extra security layer or whatever it may be, this is the performance hit. This is the overhead from Windows. Hate that. Be upset about Windows for that. Do whatever it is that you have to do, but that's the fact. There isn't a patch or a bug, or there isn't a patch to fix a bug. Now, again, AMD's indicated to me that there will be, now that this is on their radar. They must have worked pretty quickly with Microsoft here. They've suggested an update. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But yeah, I would have said, I don't know if this is a bug, but this is what's happening. And I probably would have, I alluded to it in the video, but I would have come out more direct at the start of the video and said, don't run this system administrator account because we don't know what that does for your security. It's less secure than the local administrator account. That much we know. Whether that's relevant.
It's hidden for a reason.
How relevant that is for you guys just gaming on your PC, not sure. But bear that in mind. And the video wasn't about a guide or a recommendation to do this. And AMD certainly wasn't recommending people do this. It was more, hey, we think we found an issue with Windows, and here's a way to show the issue. But I would have been clearer on those points if I had my time again.
It sounds like AMD was sort of, in trying to figure out where the performance difference was and exploring different angles, they went back basically to square one and thought, how is a reviewer testing these processes? Like, if you want to validate someone's data, you kind of have to, as best as possible, replicate exactly how they're testing it to see if that is true in their labs. So that would be making sure that most of the hardware that you've got is as similar as possible to the way that the reviewers were testing, but also the setup and configuration. So it seems like, based on the review guide that we've seen, that AMD's internal testing is automated. Now, I don't know that for sure.
It looks to be, yeah.
But the results, the way that they largely use, in fact, I think they entirely use built-in benchmarks and stuff, points towards some sort of automation. So it's possible that they were using the hidden system administrator account for their automated tool. Maybe that's required to run the tool. I don't know. I'm just guessing here.
It doesn't really make sense, but yeah, go on, sorry.
And then you go back to, this, you go back to, how are reviewers testing it? Well, the first thing you do is you'd reinstall Windows and you'd set up sort of a normal account because that's how most people would do it. And then, you go through, you assess things, maybe you find some different results. So it's possible that that's how things have played out internally. Again, I don't know, maybe. But, that's sort of, AMD at the moment, they're trying to figure out what's happened really in terms of, the numbers that they've shown versus the numbers that reviewers are getting. And as you said, this is one of the potential reasons. But it's always like that whole, it doesn't have to be like Windows system admin versus local admin, hidden settings versus not hidden settings. We've heard many times about Windows versus Linux and, Linux does all these sorts of performance enhancing things that run games better or whatever. But the reality is that 95 to 99% of gamers buying these processors will be doing so to run on Windows. So it's kind of like, even if Linux is way better at running Zen 5 for whatever reason, it's kind of irrelevant because most people are not going to run it in that configuration. It's almost like, it's nice to know, I guess it could be a little better if the operating system and software was different, but it is what it is. Like, most people are running on Windows. And similar with the system admin thing, like, if they can fix that for local admin normal accounts and you get a bit of a performance bump, great. That would be awesome for Windows. But if it's just something that's inherent to, as you sort of alluded to, maybe removing some security layers, running it in this, system admin account, if it can be a little faster in that account, it kind of doesn't matter because no one is going to run it in that way, or at least most people should not run it in that way.
Well,
so
also, if the scaling is the same between Zen 4 and Zen 5, it's a moot point.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make
matter.
Zen 5 better. It just means that Ryzen in general potentially suffers from something that the system admin account does not run in its weird sort of hidden way. So, yeah, with those sort of things, again, I think how it runs on other systems is kind of like a coping mechanism again, like, it's a lot better for server applications and Linux applications and those sorts of things. Like, that's nice, but this is a consumer desktop part that is most likely going to be used for desktop Windows gaming. And so the part has to stand on its merits for that use case. And on top of that, AMD advertises it for that. So it's not like they've advertised this as a Linux server CPU that you will be putting into your, I don't know, home servers. I don't know what it would be for, but they've advertised this as a consumer part for Windows and Windows gaming. So,
to conclude this, my gut feeling is that pretty much all CPUs will see a similar sort of uplift in the games that we've shown. So I don't think it's just an AMD thing. I think it'll also apply to Intel. I haven't done that testing yet. It's something I would like to look at and we'll probably try and get to as soon as possible. Whether or not it's a bug, I'm not convinced it's a bug. Again, AMD was sort of hinting at that being a possibility. I think it's just the way Windows works. So I think that overhead is here to stay. But maybe now that AMD's brought to Microsoft's attention, it's something they can tweak up. Again, I don't even know why it's, AMD saying it's the elevated privileges. Don't know. We'll have to wait and see that. But my gut feeling is this applies to all CPUs. And I know for a fact it's not a Zen 5 thing. So it's just a Windows thing. Maybe we can improve the Windows gaming experience overall, or maybe that's just the way it is. But yeah, the main goal of that content was to be like, hey guys, you may hear about this administrator level privilege thing that affects Zen 5 performance. That's not entirely, it's not the entire story. It actually affects performance in general. It's not a Zen 5 bug.
The final thing that I wanted to talk about in this episode, I don't know if you wanted to talk about it, but last week you flagged at the end of the podcast a rant about how AMD has handled the Zen 5 release. So did you want to get into it?
I don't know if there's too much more to say. At the time, I was pretty hot under the collar about the whole thing. I think we've seen it play out now from start to finish, really. AMD's poor handling and mismanagement of this started long before the review process. So obviously we got some slides and information at Computex that made it seem pretty exciting. I know some people were like, 16% IPC, that's a nothing burger. It's like, well, how do you feel about that now? But I was excited about that. And then we saw slides claiming gaming leadership over really impressive, really fast Intel CPUs. Stability of those CPUs may have been called into question recently, but when they're not crashing, they're fast. And if you can beat fast Intel CPUs with your non-3D Vcache parts, then that's impressive. So wrong expectations was set straight off the bat. And then, you go into reviewing and then you're seeing the results that we ultimately published and you're like, what the hell's going on here? So I don't know if I'm just going to recap the whole thing here. I'm not really sure where to go with this story, but essentially, the review samples, we were less than a week out from the initial review date. And I thought, I've trusted AMD here, right? They've told us we're getting sampled. We went to Computex, we saw them. They said, you'll have samples in time for review. I'm like, all right. So we sort of get close to a week out, and I'm like, haven't heard anything about these samples from AMD. They haven't reached out. They've communicated nothing. We got less than a week out from the reviews, so I thought, I'm going to ring AMD. So I ring them up. What's going on here? Like, are samples inbound? Are they going to arrive at my doorstep in the next hour? Oh, yeah, actually, we've been meaning to contact you about that. The reviews have been delayed by a week. Huh, okay. That's fine, I guess. Would have been awesome to know that, a little bit sooner than we did know, because obviously we have to reschedule everything and stuff like that, but whatever. I mean, that's an us problem. We're not entitled to dictate when AMD releases their CPUs, I guess, but I guess it's the start of poor communication on this. And then eventually, we do get the CPUs, and for us, it was just shy of a week out. That's fine. Unfortunately, I was a little bit sick at the time, but again, not an AMD problem. That's a me problem. Got configured, got testing, and the results were a flop. Awful, you could say. So I contacted AMD and said, guys, what's going on here? And they're like, oh, that doesn't look right. We'll look into this and get back to you. Okay, so I'm sort of sitting there going, do I waste? Because the whole week's about these launches, right? I'm not doing other things. We're just putting all of our time and energy into producing the best reviews we can. And as Gamers Nexus and others have sort of alluded to, the more time you waste on this unnecessary stuff, the less things we can test and the less in-depth review we can provide. And that's not ideal. So I'm like, well, I don't want to wait for AMD to get back to me. So I'm doing fresh installs. I changed out the motherboard. I'm wasting tons of time and energy here because we have no real guidance. We have the review guide compared the 9700X to the 14700K, claiming that it should be faster, and I wasn't seeing that. So I'm like, okay, it's barely faster than the 7700X. It's not faster than the 14700K. Something has to be wrong. I'll just keep trying to work it out. So, different memory kits, different motherboards. This eats up hours of time, and it's a bit mind-numbing. And then AMD gets back to me. Oh, yeah, the feeling is that the results are a little bit off, but they're not. We wouldn't say they're wrong. And I'm like, well, are they off or not? And they're like, the guys are running some internal testing now on your benchmark suite to let you know. Okay. They get back to me. Oh yeah, the feeling is they're not wrong, but they're a bit off. And I'm like, well, I don't want my data to be a bit off. I want it to be bang on. That's what we aim for. So, and it was still this vague, like, blah, 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 blah. And we weren't really getting anywhere. I said, well, can you just provide me with the 7700X data? Like, can AMD provide their internal testing to me so I can see and then try and work out what's going on? And okay, yep, we'll get back to you. Then they got back to me. Oh no, we're not going to share internal data at this point in time, but we've taken your criticisms on board and we're going to update the review guide to include the 7700X. When are you going to do that? Won't be in time for reviews. What do I do here, Tim? Is the data right? Is it wrong? Are we going to look like idiots saying it's only 3% faster than the 7700X? AMD could not help us with that. So, they weren't saying don't publish your data, it's wrong. They were just like, yeah, it's kind of right. It's kind of there. So what do you do with that, Tim? Like, it's frustrating, is it not?
Yeah, it's not great. And that, when I published the video talking about AMD's launch issues throughout the last couple of years, this very much was playing into that. It's the communication for these sorts of things. You need to know. Well, first of all, consumers need to know how the parts perform accurately. You don't want to be misleading them. And then when it comes to reviews, you don't necessarily need to confirm every single number and have a comprehensive guide that's got absolutely everything, every single result that anyone could ever use. But the whole point of a review guide is to provide information that will help reviewers know whether it's a bug or whether it's just how it is. And that's always the issue with reviewing. Whenever there's something negative or bad about a product, it's always that toss up. Is this an issue that can be fixed, some sort of bug or problem, or is this just how it is? And I think we've talked in the podcast before about the fine line between when do you contact a company to try and ask for help with results versus not trying to, because companies will and have in the past tried to stuff you around. If there's a hint of some sort of negative outcome or negative result that's just how the product is, some companies will try and stuff you around to try and, limit the damage to some degree, try and, throw some question marks around. We'll look into this. They take ages to come back, those sorts of things. So there's always that balancing act of trying to figure out things. But if you're providing a review guide, the review guide should include all the key information that will let you know whether your CPU is performing as expected or not, or whether it's some configuration issue.
Mm-hmm.
But when you provide not enough information and there's a lot of wishy-washy things, and even comparing to Intel CPUs, there's all sorts of problems at the moment. If your main comparison is to an Intel part, how have you configured that Intel part? What default profile have you used? If you're not fully communicating that, it's very difficult to know exactly how that part has been tested, which means that even if, for example, that their data was accurate between Zen 5 versus the Intel part, I think in the guide they only said they'd configured it to the Intel default profile. So you could have spent hours upon hours trying to figure out which default configuration or which settings they've used to get those numbers. So everything needs to be very, very clear so that you can repeat the testing yourself and go, okay, well, I got exactly what they got for that test. So therefore, my CPU is configured properly, and all my other tests that I run that aren't in the review guide are probably going to be accurate. So I guess in that sense, using built-in benchmarks and those things for testing can help. Probably try and use a newer selection of games and a more relevant selection of games would be nice, but those things can help for that sort of thing. But yeah, they needed to at the very least include more samples, more information compared to their existing parts. And yeah, they just did not do that. So
yeah, I want to make it clear as well, because I feel really this is more of a personal thing. I feel really sorry for our local AMD team, and in particular our local AMD representative, because he's not the one doing this internal testing. He's not the one calling the shots. He's the middleman that has to deal with us. So first of all, having to deal with us, not a fun time. Having to deal with honest, independent media. As someone whose sort of a job is to get positive coverage for the company, having to deal with Gamers Nexus, Harbor Unbox, not a fun time. So he does cop a lot of backlash for the things we say, because we don't care about representing AMD products in the best light, in a sense that the marketing would. If the product's good, we'll say it's good. If the product's not good, we'll say it's not good. And I hope that is clear at this point in time. But our local AMD team, local AMD guy, absolute legend. He does a great job. But regardless of, whether or not we like the local AMD guy and he does a good job, if the product's not good, we're going to say it's not good. We're not going to sugarcoat it and be well, we like the local AMD guy and we don't want his job to be hard. So, we'll be nice and just sugarcoat it. It's no, it's not how we roll. And he gets that. He knows that. I guess, his job is to sort of deal with that. So a little unfortunate for him the way that all works out. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, with these problems we've had with the communication with AMD, it's not our local AMD representative that's the problem.
No, it seems to be a company, and again, I'm only going based on the results, the outcomes that we've seen from AMD. It seems to be a company issue with how things are communicated internally. And I'm sure that our local team and representatives are feeling some of that frustration of not having all the right information at their hands to deliver to reviewers. Like, as you said, the marketing people are not the people running the benchmarks, so they can only go on what information the benchmark team has provided them. And if they're not providing the most accurate or useful information, then they're kind of getting a little screwed over there by not being
and
able to help out the reviewers and the people that
that's
they
right.
deal with.
And they're not even the marketing guys that created the troublesome slides. They cop all the backlash from it, but they didn't produce them, and they're not necessarily even happy about them. So there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on. There's a lot of people at AMD that I'm sure are frustrated by how this whole thing's been handled and played out, and don't necessarily blame us. So
Yeah,
there'll be mixed feelings, I'm sure, internally, but yeah, there'll be frustrations in different directions.
Yeah, and it goes, I'm sure, all the way back to the people who've actually engineered the CPUs, who have to deal with how the marketing decides to present them. Like, the person that created Zen 5 is not deciding, hey, compare that only to a 14900K and maybe juice the numbers a little bit there to make it look really good. Like, across the majority of engineers that we've ever spoken to at events like Computex and those sorts of things, they always just want the product to be presented the way that it is, and sort of their work to be shown in a way that is accurate and reflective of what they've done. So if they've created a great server architecture that's awesome for Epic CPUs, and then marketing is kind of screwing up a little bit, presenting it for the desktop side of things, engineers feel that like they get disappointed by some of those decisions. And things like pricing, engineers do not set the prices of products. They're not going, hey, this awesome CPU that I've made, let's make that ludicrously expensive so that no one can afford it. And I'm sure NVIDIA GPUs is an example. When they were first announced, people that worked really hard on products like the 4080 12 gigabyte, which was renamed to the 4070 Ti, right? They're not sitting around going, damn, it was great that they made that a $900 GPU and called it a 4080 12 gigabyte. It's like, I worked really hard on that GPU, and marketing's made some questionable calls there. So everyone in these companies is human, and that's something that gets lost a little bit with the discussion around things. And when we make videos like the video I made, it's not a criticism of individuals. It's a criticism of how the company as a whole operates. And it's the same with any discussions about marketing materials being wrong, things being misleading. It's not that specific person, unless it's like an executive, because ultimately executives are responsible. So that is fair game. But it's not like, oh yeah, John Smith, who works at slide creating, he's the PowerPoint guy. Let's go after him, right? It's more a company issue. And hopefully, based on the feedback around this launch, the video that we've made, the videos other people have made around Zen 5, that there will be some internal discussions and things will improve and change. But again, like I said in my video, I think AMD and a lot of people at the company were put in a hard position with Zen 5, because there's only so much you can do to present a product that isn't great in a way that doesn't, like, I can understand why a review guide, while it's not ideal for us, wouldn't include the 7700X numbers, because if that gets out, like if that leaks a week before launch that AMD is claiming that these parts are like 3 to 5% better, it's not good.
It is what it is, though.
It's true.
So that was my frustration there, really, and leading right up to even the day of the reviews going live. Like, I was pretty pissed off, I'll say, with AMD, because it was the day the reviews went live. I had spoken directly with multiple reviewers who were confirming similar gaming margins to me. Some a little bit bigger, some a little bit smaller, but it came down to the type of games tested and how they
within the margin of error, for sure. Yeah.
And I've still got AMD sort of going, because I'm telling AMD, like, I said to them, I said, I'm calling this a flop. Like, I let them know in advance. And I guess that's possibly why they went about it the way they did. They sort of said, oh, like, your review sounds like it's going to be more critical than other reviewers. We just want to let you know that, maybe it was like they're trying to wriggle out of it a bit. And I'm like, look, tell me this: have other reviewers got different gaming results on average? And I still don't know. What are your gaming results on average? And they're hinting at me that, maybe it's about 5%. And I'm like, is it 5% or not? What is your internal data saying? And they would not tell me, but they were hinting it was only a few percent more than what I had. And I'm like, well, I've got 3%. A few percent more than that's 5%. Are you at 5%? Couldn't really confirm. And the other reviewers I've spoken with are between 2 and 5%. So if I'm at 3%, I don't care what other reviewers are saying about this. It's a flop for gaming. I don't care how some other people may or may not be sugarcoating it based on what you're telling me. That's not good. But again, nothing was really confirmed whether it was 5% or not, which is just ludicrous, right? It's frustrating when you're trying to get an accurate review, and then the reviews go live. I check, Tech Power Up, which I'd already seen their data days ahead of the release, 2% on average, and they weren't wrong. There were plenty of others. Look, there was a couple of outlier reviews, and some of them were easy to spot why. I think if you test Zen 5, because the suggestion is there's an I/O bottleneck, right? Because the I/O die is the same. That seems to be the limiting factor for gaming. There's no real latency improvements. If anything, latency may have gone backwards. So they've overcome that with other things. But that's why we see this inconsistent performance. Like it's slower in some games, faster in others, much faster in a game like ACC. But AMD's own internal testing is, I want to say, exclusively based on canned benchmarks. I think that is the case. I don't recall seeing a benchmark that wasn't a built-in benchmark. And, like Linus Tech Tips, I'm not calling them out. I'm just saying, I'm stating a fact here. The LTT Labs use automated benchmarking, which relies on canned benchmarks for the most part. I think they tested with Rocket League, which is a weird game, I'm just going to say it, to test a brand new CPU architecture on, because Rocket League will run on your dual-core laptop. But Rocket League is a canned benchmark in the sense that I imagine they'd be using a replay. And
I would have thought so.
I think in that example as well, the replay isn't nearly as CPU intensive as the dynamic gameplay. So that's a concern for CPU benchmarking. But, a lot of people who tested Shadow of the Tomb Raider tested using the canned benchmark, which is really predominantly a GPU benchmark. You want to test a game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider in-game in one of the sort of village town type sections, because it's actually it's a very CPU demanding game, quite surprisingly so. So if you test Zen 5 in games where you're still somewhat CPU limited, but it's not a CPU intensive game, like Rocket League, like League of Legends, like Forza Horizon 5, those type of games, that's where we're seeing the slightly larger than expected margin for Zen 5. But if you test a lot of the games like we tested, so A Plague Tale Requiem is a really good example, especially where we test that game. Baldur's Gate 3, we test at Baldur's Gate, the city of Baldur's Gate. We pan around a lot quite quickly, very CPU intensive. Cyberpunk, Phantom Liberty, Dogtown, we test there. High crowd density, so CPU intensive game. Again, it's not, if you test with the Cyberpunk built-in benchmark, nowhere near as CPU demanding as actually playing the game. So that's a good example where the built-in benchmark is a good GPU benchmark, not a good CPU benchmark.
And that's usually what built-in benchmarks are for. It's for GPU limited comparisons, because most gamers playing the games are going to be GPU limited. So.
And look, Horizon Forbidden West is a game that I've tested previously and said isn't CPU intensive because I'd only played for 4 or 5 hours. But we've had people comment saying, if you play right to the end, you go to Fleet's End and a few of the bigger establishments, much more CPU demanding. So I got a save game much further in the game, tested at a town that was absolutely much more CPU demanding. So I've seen people testing Zen 5 out in an open field, showing it to be faster than Zen 4, and they're getting 200 FPS plus, whereas we're down around 150 FPS testing in a CPU-intensive town. And, Zen 5 is a little bit it's about the same performance as Zen 4 under that circumstance. And again, same thing with Hogwarts Legacy, testing in game there. That's the only way you can test that game. Homeworld 3, we are using the canned benchmark because that's actually an example where it's really required. Homeworld 3 is near on impossible to test the game in an intense location. You can't reproduce that. You've got to play a game. So you're talking about hours to get something that's not reproducible under the same conditions. So the built-in benchmark there is quite good. And there are some built-in benchmarks. Like, again, we use Watch Dogs Legion's built-in benchmark. That works really well. It's very CPU demanding. Again, like Starfield's a game that AMD didn't test with, despite it being an AMD-sponsored title. That's, again, very CPU limited, very CPU demanding. And we found Zen 4's not good in Starfield. So, and the list goes on. Last of Us Part 1, for example, AMD didn't test with that game either. So what I'm seeing is the reviews that got more favorable results, as good as AMD or better, used canned benchmarks that aren't particularly CPU demanding. The reviewers that got much smaller margins used more modern AAA games that, testing at 1080p with an RTX 4090 makes them much more CPU bound. So that's one of the main discrepancies I've seen. And again, Linus Tech Tips were one of the review outlets that I think only tested 4 games. They were all canned benchmarks, and they were benchmarks that I wouldn't necessarily use. I'm not calling them out, that their data is what it is. I'm more using them as an example because LTT has publicly said, and they're very proud of the fact that they automate their benchmarking, which is what AMD seems to do. And we've been in opposition of that method. We think canned benchmarks in general, and in particular automated benchmarking for games, just doesn't work, doesn't lead to accurate data, and just isn't a good way of testing highly dynamic modern AAA games.
So, yeah, I think that probably covers the Zen 5 things and how AMD has sort of handled this release and things that we're seeing from the review data. I think that, I'm not expecting with releases that companies necessarily have to share detailed internal testing data because, there's probably some things that they don't want to share necessarily around releases. But I think with the bare minimum is sort of just simple confirmation, yes, no, is this data accurate or not?
Yeah.
And being wishy-washy on that, sort of saying, oh, maybe it's a little off, maybe it's not. I don't know. It seems it's accurate, but not that accurate. That's not
the problem.
ideal.
That's my hang up. Like, if they don't want to share the information, don't. Hey guys, how does it compare to the 7700X? We're not sharing that information, or we don't have that information at this point in time, which both aren't acceptable in my opinion, but fine. That doesn't waste my time. I then talk with half a dozen to a dozen other reviewers. If they confirm my data, we go forward. But when I've confirmed my data with them and AMD's like, it's not quite right, that's a problem. I don't want to. You don't want to ahead of time publish data that the manufacturer or company is telling you isn't quite accurate. It's like, it's not wrong, it's just not quite right. And just as a quick example, a company that has handled stuff like that well in the past is MSI. We wrecked their X570 motherboards. They came back to us, their initial knee-jerk reaction was, that can't be right, our boards are better than that. How did you test? Let us reproduce your testing. And they went away. It was 1 day later. They contacted me and they said, well, disappointingly, we have confirmed your findings. That sucks. We need to do better. We will do better. End of story. They didn't challenge the review. They didn't ask it to be pulled down. They didn't ask us to retest. They confirmed our data and they admitted it. So all I wanted was AMD to, I gave AMD the courtesy of sending them all my data. I sent them my graphs, everything, how I tested, and said, look, this is my opinion. It's not good. It's not good. I'm now giving you multiple days ahead of the release of the reviews to validate my data. And if I've done something wrong or there's a bug, let me know as soon as possible. And they proceeded to do the wishy-washy thing, which just, pissed me right off.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I think that if a company is going to say that your data is wrong or not accurate in some way, that there's kind of a courtesy of like explaining why or like how they've tested or some other reason, like saying like, oh, your data's not accurate, but we won't tell you why or where or what's wrong with it.
Just to be clear, they didn't. That was sort of the frustrating part. They didn't say it was wrong. They didn't say it was inaccurate. They didn't necessarily say they disagreed with it. They just said it was a bit off. So it's kind of like the Intel recommended default spec thing. It's similar language that says the same thing. It's like, well, if it's a bit off, it's wrong. No, we're not saying it's wrong. It's just not quite as good as what we're getting. Then I consider that to be wrong. But they wanted to stress that they weren't calling my data wrong. So, as I said, what do you do with that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, but yeah, with all that sort of internal testing thing, it's always up to the company to share things. And I guess my point more, if they were claiming it was wrong, then they would have to provide an answer. And I think
Sure.
it either goes a couple of different ways, right? You could go down the we're not providing any additional information path, which, as you said, doesn't waste, because once that happens, it's like, okay, communication over. We'll just
Move on.
go deal with other reviewers or find some other way to confirm the data, right? You could validate the data, and you don't have to provide detailed internal testing when you validate data. You just send the data, they go, give it a thumbs up. Yep, that's pretty much what we're seeing. Good job. End of story.
Mm-hmm.
And then if the data is inaccurate, then I think there's a courtesy would be to explain why, or explain the differences or margins or something. So if you got 3%, they were seeing 10%, it would make sense to say, hey, we got 10%, you're seeing 3%, pretty large difference. Probably go and look at the XYZ or something, or we'll try to figure it out.
Which
but yeah, handling it with wishy-washy is not ideal.
Yeah, and I think that's what they're still trying to do. But at the same time, I believe they're testing Cyberpunk still with the built-in benchmark, while we're testing a CPU-intensive, dense populated area of the game, densely populated by NPCs, which can lead to differences, especially with different architectures. So, I don't know how much they're actually replicating testing there. And again, like, it's either there's basically at this point in time, there's either a fundamental problem at either the software or the hardware level with Zen that is causing some kind of inconsistent performance but again, is it even that? Like, the reviewers that I sort of trust have all got pretty similar numbers. And the inconsistencies really come down to the games. Like, we saw an 18% uplift in ACC because that's a very cache sensitive game. And I suspect the increased L1 cache capacity is playing a pivotal role there. I don't know if I've said this already. I think at the end of the day, Zen 5, regardless of operating system and in test environment and whatnot, isn't very good for gaming. I think that's the end of story. Now, whether there's some kind of software update, new chipset driver, microcode, or something that changes that, short of that, it's not very good. I don't expect there'll be anything like that fixes it, but I'm certainly not ruling it out. But yeah, that's the end of the story, right, Tip? It's just not very good for gaming at this point in time.
Yes, I agree with that. All right, let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about our boring lives. All right, we're back. Boring lifetime, which is hopefully, Steve, are you taking a break after this? Because you've done a lot of testing, a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I haven't done a whole lot of sleeping. That's about the only thing I haven't done over the last week. Well, the only thing I really have done is sit at my desk and benchmark and test stuff. Because yeah, there's a lot of stuff obviously going on that we haven't even talked about in this podcast. New game testing with 40 something GPUs, so that's pretty full on. You're doing an optimization guide on Black Myth Wukong, aren't you?
Yeah, that should be coming out when the NDA for the game itself expires, because
That's early next week, right?
In-game footage for that. So, yep, that should be coming out at some point. So,
yep, well,
it's going well.
Yeah, I've logged a combined 40 something hours in the benchmark tool. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
You've seen that one pass many, many times at this point, which is
and it's
nice.
a bit of a tedious process as well, because it's the benchmark tool's been great. They've even patched it and fixed a few crashing issues and stuff that I had to run into on occasion. But it's the resolution is in a different menu to the resolution scaler. So when you change a preset or the resolution, it'll then change the resolution scale, but in a different menu, so you don't see it change. So you have to change the resolution, apply that, then go back to the graphical settings menu, and then change the resolution slider to whatever you want using FSR, DLSS, or XESS. So that's something to be aware of, that the resolution slider sort of does its own thing, especially when changing resolutions or quality presets. So that I thankfully picked up on that almost instantly, so that didn't catch me out. But yeah, I've spent a lot of time in that. So yeah, not much sleeping in my boring life. It's been a crazy couple of weeks for me. So my plan is to wrap up this podcast shortly, finish writing the script for the Black Myth content. Balin's going to come in this afternoon to edit that. We should have that online for everyone tomorrow night, so the night after the podcast goes live, and that'll be good. But this is all work stuff that I'm talking about, of course, because I actually have nothing else to talk about. And yeah, I, for the last 2 weeks, I've been locked in my den, and I've had every single computer that could possibly benchmarking something. We've been working on numerous different content pieces and stuff, and yeah, so come Saturday lunchtime, I'll be spending some time with the family, relaxing, probably watch the footy that night, even though that's a bit of a non-event for me at this point. Hopefully the weather's decent on Sunday, spend some time with the kids outside and relax, and then I'll be largely taking next week off. So there'll be a bit less content next week, or a lot less. I think you're picking up the slack there a bit though, aren't you? And we've got the Q&As, of course. So you and I will be catching up in person on Monday. We'll be spending the day together, which is always a thrill for you. And we'll talk. Well, God, we'll be answering some questions, I imagine. And then we've got the Patreon and Float Plane live stream, so that'll be good to pick up on that again, because it's been a while since we've been able to do that for various different reasons. And then podcast next week. So basically next week I'm doing the Q&A stuff, the podcast, and I'll be, hopefully the weather will be half decent. It's just the way, isn't it, Tim? The last week and a half has just been amazing weather. Sunny, relatively warm for this time of year. Great days for working outside. And I've been locked in here and I've barely seen the outside world. Sometimes I don't even know, is it still light outside? I'm not sure. Where are we? I have to check the Windows time. And then next week looks like being pretty mixed, somewhat ordinary weather. But I'll still try and get outside because I want to get the Harbour Unbox gym done. And that's probably still another 6 months away. And it'll be a lot more than that if I don't get cracking on it. So
yeah, get stuck into that. That should be good.
Yeah, I'll spend at least a couple of half days out there, and then maybe some half days. Because, I know something's going to pop up, right? Like I already want this Windows bug, for a lack of a better term. I want to test Intel CPUs. There's a couple of privilege type setting things I want to test on the local account. People are asking for Windows 10 comparison testing. Is the overhead present there comparing the local administrator, the system administrator? I don't know. So there's a lot of follow-up content people are asking for. So
yeah, and Intel microcode as well. Like I know some people have started digging into that stuff, and
that's an interesting one to bring up. I don't know what, like, obvious. There's been the one or two crazies in the comment section accusing us of focusing on Zen 5 and not the microcode and blah 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 blah. But I don't know how we tackle that. It's a bit of a problem because I can benchmark the microcode update. I think there'll be more to come, so I'm not sure how quick you want to jump on that one. But you've sort of got to benchmark, a Gigabyte board, an Asus board, an MSI board. So there's quite a lot of work there. And I think overall, well, at least what we're seeing so far is there's a very, very minor difference in performance. And you can talk about voltages and stuff, but ultimately it's like, how useful is that at this point in time?
Yeah, you could talk about the performance is the interesting thing because you can't really discuss the stability.
You can't talk about stability at all. So the problem I have with it is why I haven't rushed to it is because it's ultimately pointless, right? We can't reverse our stance just yet. Like we need it's a community effort. We need to hear from the guys that are running servers, from the guys that are having stability problems. Has this addressed your stability problems? There's so much data that needs to come in. So I think it's going to be a while before we know if the microcode update's done anything. And me benchmarking my one CPU that I barely use that already wasn't crashing, it's going to tell us what it does in terms of performance, which as far as I can tell is very minimal, but it's not going to change our current stance on the recommendation of these KSkew 13th and 14th gen parts. And we're not going to know if stability is improved. So that's why I haven't rushed to that testing, because there's far more interesting things to look at that are much more concrete at this point in time. But I will get to it. It'll probably be something that I do next week, just, a couple of hours or, here and
Yeah,
there.
you say, oh, I'm taking a week off, but
I know.
actually...
Well, actually, I'm going to test this Windows thing, with multiple different CPUs and multiple different operating systems with multiple different configurations. And then I'm going to look into the Intel microcode. And then there's the Star Wars game that I'm definitely testing. And actually, I'm not sleeping for the next 2 weeks, Tim, and I'll be repeating myself on the podcast, my boring life section for the next foreseeable.
Yep.
So anyway,
possible.
So I unfortunately I have nothing. You have to carry this segment once again, Tim. It's all on you.
Well, I have been doing a few things because you've been doing a lot of the videos on Hardware Unboxed, so I've just been toiling away at a few other things at the moment. But with the nice weather, I did go out and do some more weeding of the garden with the old selective herbicide, which is always very nice to use. So very satisfying how you can just spray weed killer. It doesn't kill grass, but kills weeds.
Oh, so this
Magic
is the broadleaf selective herb. Yep, that stuff's lovely. Works well on the lawn.
Yeah, so while the weather's been nice, I took some time to go out and do that and, start preparing the veggie garden for the spring for us. Obviously, Southern Hemisphere here, so we're heading into spring and good time for planning stuff, getting all that stuff done. So done a bit of that on the weekends and things.
Nice.
Well, not that I can really talk too much about it, but obviously we've got Black Myth Wukong testing at the moment. So I have been playing the game itself, not just the benchmark tool, but can't talk anything about that at the moment, unfortunately. But prior to that, I did play Hellblade. What's it called? Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga.
Senua's Saga.
Terrible name, because the first game's called like Senua's Sacrifice or something. It's got a different order of the two things. Right. Senua's Sacrifice, Hellblade or something. I just remember
it as Hellblade, to be honest.
Is it Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 and the first game is Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice? I don't know.
You'd have to Google it.
Yeah, terrible names. Anyway,
whatever. It's whatever.
I did not finish the first game, so whatever the first game was, didn't really enjoy all that much. I was like, not for me.
Yep.
I played the second one the whole way through. It's very short, so probably only took me about 7 to 8 hours to finish the whole thing, so not that long by modern game standards, I guess. Very visually impressive game. Very, very impressive throughout the whole game. Just beautiful visuals. I believe it's an Unreal Engine 5 game that uses all the bells and whistles with nanite, lumen. I believe it doesn't use hardware accelerated ray tracing, but still manages to look fantastic. So good job by the developers there to obviously make it primarily for Xbox consoles, I would have thought. But yeah, beautiful looking game. Looks fantastic. And that's really the highlight of the game. It's probably not a game I would necessarily recommend. The gameplay itself is almost like a walking simulator, which is kind of like
clunky, slow and boring in my opinion. But
it's kind of like
me.
I guess walking simulator is kind of like a derogatory term to describe like games where you just walk around. And there's certainly games where the majority of the game is just exploration and walking that I've found very enjoyable. So for me, like slow-paced walking games are not a turn-off necessarily. But with this game, it's kind of like the combat is very simple and repetitive. There's not a lot to it. You're just kind of doing the same thing in all encounters. And usually with these sorts of like exploration games, walking simulator type games, they're carried by like some sort of intriguing story. And with this game, like I get what they were going for with the, depictions of psychosis, which is a real mental illness and those sorts of things. I get what they were going for. It just wasn't a story that I really found all that interesting, and the whole sort of mythological elements and those sorts of things relating to mental health. That wasn't really something that I found that great. So it's a game that I would recommend just to play because of how good it looks. Like it's really impressive what you're running on your PC. It's available on Game Pass, so you don't even have to, I guess you have to put up with the Microsoft Store.
I got to jump in. So you're recommending it for fellow RTX 4090 owners?
Yeah, although it does apparently run okay on other GPUs.
It does. I'm just staring, you entitled YouTuber.
But yeah, like there's games where I would recommend them for visuals. Like if this game did not have good quality visuals, definitely would be a don't even bother with it. But the visuals, the audio experience in the game is really good as well. So it does some really interesting surround sound type things.
You didn't find it annoying though?
Not really.
Okay. Yeah, I found it a bit repetitive and annoying personally. I only played a couple of hours because,
Oh, with the surround sound audio stuff, with the voices and
yeah,
things.
yep.
Yeah, that's not too bad.
Okay,
It's an interesting effect
uh,
that, you know.
sure. I'm not big single player gamer, so I'm coming at perspective from a
Sure. I mean,
multiplayer gamer.
this
But,
game didn't really, you know, excite me in any significant way. Like, I wasn't like, oh, you got to go play this right now. Like, this is an amazing. It's not like an
mhm.
Alan Wake 2, which is again a fairly slow paced, visually impressive game. That there's a lot more to Alan Wake that's much better. But from a visual perspective, the way it looks, and you know, I enjoy walking around and seeing some nice scenery and being like, "Hey, this is running in real time on my GPU." That's pretty impressive. But once you get a couple of hours in, it's
Uh,
like, okay, I've got what this game is going for, and yeah, if they'd been able to complement it with really good gameplay, then that would have been a real hit. But
mhm.
unfortunately, they just haven't really executed on that front. So yeah, I'll have more thoughts on Black Myth Wukong probably next week when we can talk about what the game's actually like, because a lot of people are playing the benchmark. They're playing the benchmark tool to see what's happening there. But yeah, the game, I'm sure you'll see reviews between now and next podcast from actual game reviewers. So yeah,
Yep.
that's probably it
The
for this one.
the benchmark tool, while based on what you're saying, seems accurate to the game performance.
Yeah,
Um,
it is the actual game. Well, I mean, it doesn't show you gameplay, obviously, but it
yep.
flies through part of the real game that you will see very early in Chapter 1. So it is, that path and everything is not created for the benchmark. That is the game world.
Yep. So what I think the only problem they're going to run into there is that people will be testing and going, oh, if I turn on frame gen, quality DLSS or FSR, whatever it may be, and then use the cinematic preset and whatever else you enable, maybe ray tracing to a degree. Oh, I can actually get like 60 FPS, and when it plays through the benchmark, 60 FPS looks great. It's very smooth, because you're essentially watching a movie because it's a canned
Yeah.
benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a 60 FPS video, and if you think that's pretty good, but I expect the experience when you actually play the game at 60 FPS with frame generation enabled is going to be pretty damn awful, especially if it is quite fast paced with the combat.
Mm.
So I think people are going to sort of get the tool, run it, go, this looks amazing. The visuals are awesome. Look how high quality I can get. I'm getting 60 FPS with frame gen. And then you go to play the game and it's going to probably feel awful, is my expectation.
Well, there hasn't been a game that I've played where the output from frame gen at 60 FPS has ever felt good to play, because the base frame rate is low. Like, it's like 30 FPS, 30 to 40 FPS, which just doesn't feel great. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, that's no different to other games. You don't have to talk about my experiences with Black Myth to know that 60 FPS with frame gen is not good in most games. Maybe Flight Simulator is the one exception where the game is, you're
minimal
not really
input.
doing anything. There's no
Yeah.
input.
So
But yeah, like, you can watch gameplay videos. But I think it's good to know what your PC is capable of. The benchmark tool, it appears
awesome.
accurate to the game in-game
Mhm.
performance, because it does use a real part of the game. But in terms of like the visual side of things, like how it will look in terms of frame generation with input, obviously frame generation with visuals, because if you're flying around in a smooth, consistent path, it's very different to fighting the enemies and bosses in the game and those sorts
Mhm.
of things. And you can look at gameplay footage that's from previews that shows you what the gameplay is actually like. So you'll get that sort of sense of how different the gameplay is versus the benchmark tool. And just in general, there are obviously different environments and stuff in the game as well.
Yeah,
So
but the developer releasing the benchmark tool is awesome. I wish every major AAA title or even game had such a tool that is representative of the real gaming experience. So I think all of that's great. I think the tool's been awesome. I really, really like it. I'm all for it. I just think it probably doesn't accurately portray the frame generation side of things.
yeah, that's true. And I think that applies to most built-in benchmarks when it comes to visuals in general, because a lot of like the temporal artifacts that you see with upscaling and frame gen and that sort of thing, you don't really ever see those in built-in benchmarks, just because of how consistent the movements are between each frame, which is really great for those technologies, because the more consistent and repeatable and predictable the movement is from one frame to the next, the better things like upscaling and frame generation look, which is very different to how games play. So that's been the case for most things. But I think I would really like to see a lot of developers go down this path, take a slice of the game. And this is why I think as well the Watch Dogs Legion benchmark is also a slice of the game, like you fly through a part of the real game. I like to see that sort of benchmark, release it for free ahead of the game launch so everyone is getting a feel for what the game's performance is like on their hardware. All the settings are in there, accurate to in-game performance. I think that's a really good combination of things. And it's sort of, I feel like it's built a bit of excitement towards the game's release because the benchmark tool's out now. So people are sort of getting, oh, yeah, can my PC run this? Can my PC not run this? Oh, this is what the game sort of looks like, getting a feel for it. And I think it's a good way to sort of, I don't know, market games and get people excited while providing useful information to people.
Yeah, that's right. It's a win-win. So awesome to see.
Yeah, so it's good. So yeah, that'll do it for this podcast. Thanks to everyone who's listened/watched this episode. Hopefully we'll be back next week. Steve won't be in vacation mode and we'll get out some more stuff relating to whatever's happening next week. And until then, thanks for listening and we'll see you in the next one.